Happy New Year and happy Public Domain Day here in the United States. As of today, January 1st, 2025, works first published in 1929, including books, musical compositions, and films, are now in the public domain. Additionally, sound recordings from 1924 are also in the public domain since, due to the ridiculous complexity of American copyright law, sound recordings are covered by a different statute than pretty much everything else. When a work passes into the public domain, that means it is no longer covered by copyright protection and is now free for anyone to exhibit, distribute, or adapt. If you want to produce a public domain play, or record your own version of a public domain piece of music, or hold a public screening of a public domain movie, or adapt a public domain book into a movie, you can just do it. You don't need to get permission. You don't need to purchase a license. You don't need to pay royalties to the rights holder. Works in the public domain are just that, the domain of the public. They belong to all of us. Last year, the big news was Mickey Mouse becoming public domain. There's nothing this year to quite compare to that, but there are a few more iconic characters that are joining the public domain in 2025, or beginning to join the public domain, I should say. Because if a character only appears in a single work, it's easy. When that work becomes public domain, so does the character. But when a character appears in many different works, published over many years, it's a little more complicated. Mickey Mouse, as seen in Steamboat Willie, became public domain last year because Steamboat Willie became public domain. And this year, a dozen more Mickey Mouse animated shorts also become public domain, including The Carnival Kid, which is the first time we hear Mickey talk. So Mickey as seen in those works and the aspects of Mickey's character seen in those works are public domain, but anything Mickey was in or anything about Mickey that was introduced in works that came after that is still under copyright. The same is true for two other characters who are entering the public domain for the first time this year. First, there's Tintin. He might not be such a big deal to many of us these days, especially here in the US, but Tintin is one of the most beloved and influential comic strip characters ever created. There are statues of this guy and his dog, Snowy, all over Belgium, where he was created by Belgian cartoonist Hergé. His earliest adventures are now in the public domain. So, those of you who saw that Tintin movie Steven Spielberg made like 15 years ago and said to yourselves, I could write a better Tintin movie than that, start typing. Just remember not to include anything from Tintin stories published after 1929. You don't want the Belgians after you. Also entering the public domain for the first time this year, Popeye. Again, this is only the version of Popeye that was published in 1929, and that's important because 1929, Popeye didn't derive his superhuman strength from eating spinach. Fun fact, he originally got his strength from rubbing the three hairs on the head of Bernice the Lucky Wiffle Hen. So there you go. Now that's all yours. Tintin and Popeye are both comic strip characters in their original forms. There's another comic strip character entering the public domain this year who was adapted to that medium. Tarzan. The character of Tarzan first appeared in 1912 and has been largely in the public domain for some time, though many of the later Tarzan novels by Edgar Rice Burroughs are still under copyright. This year, the Tarzan comic strip begins to enter the public domain. It's not as well known as the original novels or the many films made about Tarzan, but in various forms as both a daily and a Sunday strip, it ran from 1929 to 2002. If you're a muralist who's always wanted to paint a gigantic reproduction of the earliest Tarzan comics on the side of a building somewhere, now you can just do it. Assuming you've got permission from the owner of the building, I mean. The exterior wall of your apartment building is in public domain. Probably. I don't actually know. 2025 is a big year for books and other printed works in the public domain. Some of the most celebrated titles in 20th century American literature are now free from copyright, including Ernest Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms, Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, William Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, Dashiell Hammett's The Maltese Falcon, and the first English language version of Eric Maria Remarque's novel All Quiet on the Western Front, translated by Arthur Wesley Wheen. One of my favorite titles in this year's new crop of public domain books is called Is Sex Necessary? Or Why You Feel the Way You Do by E.B. White and James Thurber. The book parodies supposedly more serious works like William J. Robinson's Sex Knowledge for Men, Eleanor Glynn's The Philosophy of Love, and Theodore Hendrik von de Velde's Ideal Marriage, Its Physiology and Technique. I swear to God, that last one is a real book written by a real person who really had that name. Not only that, it was a bestseller for decades and was reprinted dozens of times. In Is Sex Necessary? White and Thurber poke fun at books like those, books that seek to examine love, romance, sexuality, etc. through the penetrating lenses of philosophy or psychology. And White and Thurber accomplished this with unbreakably straight faces, their tongues planted firmly in cheeks. To give you a sense of the book, here's an excerpt from Chapter 4, The Sexual Revolution, being a rather complete survey of the entire sexual scene. The sexual revolution began with man's discovery that he was not attractive to woman as such. His masculine appearance not only failed to excite woman, but in many cases it only served to bore her. The result was that man found it necessary to develop attractive personal traits to offset his dull appearance. This would have been a solution to his difficulty, but in the course of developing himself mentally, he inadvertently became so intelligent an animal that he saw how comical the whole situation was. It was the heyday of monogamy, and in order to contemplate marriage, it was necessary for a man to decide on one particular woman. This he found next to impossible for the reason that he had unconsciously set up so many mental barriers and hazards. Let me mention a few. 1. The fear that his fiancée might get fat inside of a few years. 2. The use of a word, phrase, or punctuation mark by his fiancée that annoyed him. I am thinking at the moment of the case of a young man who, in his junior year in college, had found the girl he believed ideal for him to marry, and then one day learned, quite by accident, that she was in the habit of using the word howdy. Days and nights he spent trying to reconcile himself to the idea of it, weighing the young lady's extreme beauty and affability against her one flaw. In the end, he could not stomach it and broke the troth. 3. Difference in height. If a man fell in love with a woman taller than himself, which sometimes happened, he became morose from dwelling on the objections to such an alliance. This particular situation usually had a way of settling itself automatically. There were so many reasons, real or imaginary, that just the mere business of thinking about them broke him in health and he died, leaving a margin of several weeks before the date of the wedding. 4. The suspicion that if he waited 24 hours or possibly less, he would likely find a lady even more ideally suited to his taste than his fiancée. To deny the possibility of her existence would be, he felt, to do a grave injustice to her, to himself, and to his fiancée. Man's unflinching desire to give himself and everybody else a square deal was the cause of much of his disturbance. Man had become, you see, a thinking being. He had come to know enough about permutations and combinations to realize that with millions of females to choose from, the chances of his choosing the ideal mate were almost zero. Also now in the public domain, Rope, the play by Patrick Hamilton, which debuted in 1929 and almost 20 years later was adapted into a film directed by Alfred Hitchcock. And hey, speaking of Alfred Hitchcock, his first sound film, Blackmail, premiered in 1929, and it is now in the public domain in the United States, along with every other film released in 1929. The movies in 1929 were still at the very beginning of the sound era, so many of the most notable films entering the public domain this year are, like Hitchcock's Blackmail, the first sound films for their directors or stars. A few of the more noteworthy examples are The Black Watch, the first sound film directed by John Ford; Dynamite, the first sound film directed by Cecil B. DeMille; The Wild Party, the first sound film starring the It Girl herself, Clara Bow. 1929 also saw the release of The Return of Sherlock Holmes, the first talkie to feature the character of Sherlock Holmes; and Atlantic, the first sound film made about the sinking of the Titanic. Three legendary names in comedy movies released milestone projects in 1929. The Coconuts, the first Marx Brothers movie; Welcome Danger, Harold Lloyd's first sound film; and Spite Marriage, Buster Keaton's last silent film. Not Keaton's best work, but not a bad one, and good enough for Keaton to close out his silent era and essentially his career as the star of his own films on a relatively high note. Also now in the public domain from 1929, two classic films directed by G.W. Pabst and starring Louise Brooks, Pandora's Box and Diary of a Lost Girl. Louis Buñuel's surrealist masterpiece Un Chien Andalou, co-written with Salvador Dali. Woman on the Moon, an overlooked sci-fi epic directed by Fritz Lang about a group of explorers who travel to the dark side of the moon in search of gold.
Hi folks, it's Steve from A Couple of Days Later, and I'm sitting here editing the video that you're watching right now, and I've just realized that I refer to this film by the title Woman on the Moon. I just did it, and I'm about to do it 3 more times in the next couple of minutes in the video, and the actual title of the movie is Woman in the Moon. And I know that, and I should have said that in the video, but I incorrectly typed it into my script as Woman on the Moon, and that's how I say it every single time I refer to the film by title in the video, because that's what it said in my teleprompter, and I guess I'm Ron Burgundy. So, just for the record, the title of this brilliant 1929 science fiction epic directed by the legendary director Fritz Lang is Woman in the Moon, not Woman on the Moon. So when I refer to it as Woman on the Moon in the next couple of minutes, just ignore me. I'm a doofus. Back to the video.
Despite the fanciful premise, it has since been noted how accurately the film predicts many of the basic elements of rocket travel, including the use of a countdown to launch, the use of a multi-stage rocket, and the depiction of the astronauts having to deal with increased G-forces during liftoff and zero gravity during the flight. By the way, here's a neat little crossover between Woman on the Moon and another new occupant of the public domain I mentioned earlier. The technical advisor on Woman on the Moon was a rocket scientist named Hermann Oberth. In the early 1950s, Hergé produced a series of Tintin stories that featured Tintin traveling to the moon, and Oberth was the technical advisor for those as well. So that's fun. Also, Oberth was a Nazi. So, not fun. Fuck that guy. But Woman on the Moon is awesome. Hallelujah, the first sound film directed by King Vidor, and one of the first films produced by a major Hollywood studio featuring an all-black cast, is now in the public domain. Though today the film seems painfully dated and bears the marks of the biases and condescending attitudes of its white filmmakers, by the standards of the time, it was remarkably progressive and treats its black characters with more dignity than most other contemporary films. On with the show. The first feature-length, all-talking, all-color film was also released in 1929 and is also now in the public domain. It's fascinating to me how selective our collective cultural memory has become about color in the movies. Many people still believe that the first color film was 1939's The Wizard of Oz. that when Dorothy steps out of her black and white cabin and into the full color land of Oz, that's the first time color was ever used in a film. The truth is, while color movies weren't the standard, they were produced for decades prior to The Wizard of Oz. There were full color silent films, and many more black and white silent films with full color sequences. And that's not including tinted films, which were also very common during the silent era. Unfortunately, color film was much more difficult to preserve, and as a result, many early color movies are now lost or exist only in black and white prints. Such is the case with On with the Show. It was the first all-talking, all-color feature, but today only one reel and a few other brief fragments of the color version are known to survive. All of the complete versions are in black and white, and hey, there's nothing wrong with black and white. But it would be nice to have a full color print of the first feature-length color talkie, wouldn't it? The Hollywood Review of 1929 is now part of the public domain. It's the kind of movie they don't make anymore. No story, no plot, just a variety show. A series of musical numbers and comedy bits featuring almost every star under contract to MGM at the time, including Norma Shearer, Lionel Barrymore, Conrad Nagel, Jack Benny, Joan Crawford, John Gilbert, Marion Davies, Laurel and Hardy, their first appearance in a sound picture, and the aforementioned Buster Keaton. The film was popular, successful, was considered for Best Picture at the second annual Academy Awards, though it didn't win, and yet today it's been essentially forgotten. The only reason I include it here is because one of the musical numbers featured in it just so happens to be the debut of a song titled Singin' in the Rain. That's right. Singin' in the Rain, the movie, didn't come along until 1952, but Singin' in the Rain, the song, came out in 1929 and is now in the public domain. And you know what that means. I'm singing in the rain, just singing in the rain. What a glorious feeling, I'm happy again. I'm laughing at clouds so dark up above. The sun's in my heart and I'm ready for love. Let the stormy clouds chase everyone from the place. Come on with the rain, I've a smile on my face. I'll walk down the lane with a happy refrain and singing, just singing in the rain. That's not the only great old song to enter the public domain this year. How about some Cole Porter? What is this thing called love? This funny thing called love. Who can solve its mystery? Why should it make a fool of me? Or how about Waitin' on a Train by Jimmie Rodgers, the father of country music? All around the water tank, waiting for a train. 1,000 miles away from home, sleeping in the rain. I walked up to a brakeman to give him a line of talk. He says, if you've got money, I'll see that you don't walk. I haven't got a nickel, not a penny can I show. Get off, you railroad bum. And he slammed the boxcar door. Yodelay, oodelay, hey, There's another great old song from 1929 that's now public domain. It's Happy Days Are Here Again. But you know what? Doesn't feel right for this moment somehow. Maybe in a few years. Until then, I'm singing in the rain, just singing in the rain.